Good afternoon. I am Arzu Yorgancıoğlu, Advocacy Council Chair of European Respiratory Society. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to Air Pollution and COVID-19 meeting, Clearing the Air and Charting a Post-Pandemic Course, which is an MEP Lung Health Group event. I'm so pleased to inform you that the MEP Lung Health Group is a new initiative launched in October this year, bringing together the healthcare professionals, patients, and public representatives to define improved ways of promoting respiratory health and to translate this dialogue into policy input across diverse areas such as health, research, environment, tobacco control, housing, energy, transport, like we are going to deal today, air quality and occupational exposures. I would like to begin with a thank you to our host MEP, Jutta Paulus, and to all of you for joining us. ERS very much values today's meeting and consider it as a big opportunity to deal with one of the most important social determinants of respiratory health, air pollution. This event is so timely that will provide important updates on research related to air pollution and health in the COVID-19 era, and we will be able to discuss the opportunities, strategies for a healthy and sustainable COVID-19 recovery. We are so delighted to have many patient groups all across Europe joining us and supporting the MEP Lung Health Group event today. I have some housekeeping issues to share with you. This event is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. Please use Q&A function to ask your questions, and we will try to get through as many as we can. We will have the questions in the end of the whole session. If you have connection problems, you can join by phone, and the details are available in the left-hand corner button of your screen. So now I am very delighted now to hand over to our host, Jutta Paulus, to say a few words. Please, Jutta.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And thank you very much for actually coming up to me, and I'll really happily host this very interesting webinar. I have looked into the air pollution as I'm the contact person of the European Parliament for the European Environment Agency. And the European Environment Agency has actually done a special report on the connections between air pollution, or rather air quality, and COVID-19, because in this year we have this unique opportunity of studying in real life data, so to speak, how air pollution is connected to people's activities, to industrial activity, to our mobility habits, but also to how do people react to other threats. For example, an unknown, up to now unknown infectious agent that affects our lungs and upper respiratory tract. But of course, the European Environment Agency has been looking into air quality issues for quite a long time already. And the main stressors for air quality is burning of fossil fuels in electricity generation, transport, industry, and households, something we want to get rid of anyway due to the need to do climate action in order to have a livable planet by the end of the century. And it is all the more important as we can really improve people's health by getting out of fossil fuels. Secondly, industrial processes and solvent use. In the chemical industry, in the mining industry, where we have a lot of people affected at their workplace, but also people living in that area. And these are mostly communities which have a lower socioeconomic status anyway, and thus are more often afflicted by pollutants and have less access to healthcare. There's the stress of agriculture. Of course, ammonia is a very important agent here, which is present in very large concentrations close to industrial farming facilities. We have waste treatment, where even in Europe we have still a lot of landfill sites which have all sorts of emissions, not only methane, but also other pollutants. And of course, we have the natural sources, volcanic eruptions, dust, sea salt spray, but these play a lesser role when it comes to human health. Air pollutants can be released directly into the atmosphere, of course, but they can also form as a result of chemical interaction. For example, it is very well known that if NOx concentrations decrease, ozone also decreases. Also, we know, meanwhile, that methane is playing a role in the formation of ozone. So there, again, we have this very close connection to agriculture and also to energy production. When it comes to air quality in Europe, I must admit that if we look at the EU limit or target values for example, particulate matter, NOx, SO2, there are not so many people affected. Mostly the numbers lie well below 20%, with the exception of ozone and benzoapyrene. But if we have a look at the WHO guidelines, then a lot more people are affected. So I think it is my duty as responsible MEP to push the European Commission to adopt the WHO guideline target values in a new legislative proposal as soon as possible. We had a meeting about that when Parliament was still open, so it was pre-COVID-19, and they said they would like to wait for a WHO value for ultrafine particulate matter, which does not yet exist. But I don't think that we should wait for too long, because the other stressors are so important also for people's health that we should not waste any time, because we know also from data that 400,000 Europeans die each year prematurely due to poor air quality. And on the other hand, we have seen how quickly air quality can actually improve when we are changing our habits, how we move, which modes of transport we use, and how strong we use industrial plants. And I think it would be possible to do something about industrial emissions just by applying the best available techniques, which will be valid from 2021. This guideline directive was last revised in 2017. So in 2021, a lot of power plants and industrial plants will have to be improved by, for example, applying filters or using other techniques. But I don't want to talk too long with those rather boring legal stuff, because we have such a great panel of experts present. I'm really happy that the Lung Health Society found so many different angles to look at this issue. And I'm very, very much excited about what you can tell us about the latest research on air quality and health, and how our lungs and respiratory system are affected by environmental stresses. I mean, everyone knows that smoking is not exactly the best thing you can do to your respiratory health, but I think it is also important to look at impacts which are not related to lifestyle of individual people, but that we have to be responsible as legislators, trying to protect the health of our citizens and the well-being of our citizens, because it's not only premature death, it's also that people are affected, for example, by COPD, and they cannot live a normal life anymore because they cannot, for example, take a walk over 4, 5, or 6 kilometers anymore. And that affects them very much in their daily life. And we should do our best to make these impacts as low as possible in order to have a good life for all Europeans. Thank you very much for organizing this event, and I'm happy to hear what research can tell us on air quality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jutta, for very kind words. And we are very excited to hear your messages, especially in terms of legislation. And we are very much looking forward to having the important plans of EU. We have a very distinguished panel of experts now, and I would like to start with Sara de Mattheis. And she is an associate professor in occupational and environmental medicine at the University of Cagliari, and an honorary senior lecturer at National Heart and Lung Institute, Imperial College London. She previously served as a member of the ERS Environment and Health Committee and currently serves as Secretary of the Occupational and Environmental Health Group within Environment Assembly of ERS. Sarah will talk about the linkages between air pollution, COVID-19 and human health. Yes, Sarah, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Arzu, for the nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this very important event and giving the possibility to present again the talk that I gave recently to the ERS Congress on the link between COVID-19 and health effects. I have no conflict of interest to disclose, and this is the outline of my presentation. So in this talk, I will focus in particular on the potential association between long-term exposure to air pollution and susceptibility to SARS-CoV-2 infection and the severity and mortality from COVID-19. And this hypothesis belongs to the naive observation of a high correlation between the hotspots in the world for COVID-19 cases and death and the areas in the world worstly affected by air pollution. That was particularly evident in Italy, in particular in the Po Valley, that is in the north of Italy and is well known as one of the most polluted areas in Western Europe, and was also the mostly hit by COVID-19 cases and death. In relation to the biological plausibility, we know from in vivo and in vitro studies that air pollution may impair ciliary transport and surfactant proteins in the airways, increase susceptibility to respiratory infections by impairing native and adaptive cell immunity response, and overexpress angiotensin-converting enzyme to receptors, and we will see later why this is important. And from epidemiological evidence, we know that air pollution can increase incidence and severity of respiratory infection, including pneumonia and even SARS. Two are the proposed biological underlying mechanisms, one direct via cellular damage, and the other indirect via oxidative stress and cytokine-mediated inflammation, both at lung level and at a systemic level. Interestingly, if you look at the proposed etiopathogenetic mechanism for SARS-CoV-2 infection, we see some important similarities, both for the direct cytotoxic effect mediated by ACE2 receptors and by hyperinflammation that can be mediated by dysregulation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system and via dysregulation of the immune response with an increased neutrophilic lymphocytic ratio. So this is why we have the proposed double hit hypothesis in the model of interaction that is nicely displayed by this article of Frontier and colleagues, where they proposed that chronic exposure to PM2.5 may increase susceptibility to SARS-CoV-2 infection by impairing host defense, in particular via activation of macrophages at the lung level, but also by overexpressing ACE2 receptors in the airways and in particular in the alveoli. This will increase the viral load and so the chance of having the most severe complications of the infection, such as pneumonia and acute respiratory distress syndrome. In parallel, NO2 could act similar in two ways, by enhancing lung damage via the direct potent redox effect, but also by increasing viral load by, again, disrupting the immune response. And what the authors of this article noticed is that there is an interesting overlap between the symptoms reported by COVID-19 patients, in particular anosmia, and the symptoms reported by patients acutely poisoned by NO2 that subsequently developed acute inhalation injury. And if we look at the wide range of health effects that have been associated with air pollution, there is a striking overlap with those reported in COVID-19 patients. Next. And these are also the comorbidities of patients, of COVID-19 patients that died from it, as it is displayed in this table from the National Institute of Health. Slide. And these are also the comorbidities that were found or highly associated with an increased chance of dying from COVID-19, as reported in a recent Chinese nationwide study that estimated that having 2 or more of these 4 comorbidities increased the chance of dying from COVID-19 of more than double the risk. Next. If we look at epidemiological evidence, the first study published in April 2020 was conducted in Europe among 4 countries. It was ecological by design, and tried to associate long-term exposure to NO2 from satellite data and COVID-19 death. And as you can see, there was a striking dose response between the NO2 concentration and death from COVID-19. Next. Yeah, and what is most notable, that 80% of COVID-19 deaths across these 4 countries were also in the most polluted regions. Maybe the most known article, also because it was highly covered by the media, was the one performed by Harvard University. That was a US nationwide study, ecological again, and addressed the relationship between long-term exposure to PM2.5 and COVID-19 death. Next. And what the author found was a striking 15% increase in COVID-19 death rate per unit of increase in PM2.5. And the merit of this study was that they were able to address several potential confounding factors, I think something like 17, even if at the aggregate level. But what is interesting, next slide, is that when they published a refined analysis, next slide, the initial effect was almost halved. And that was just by adding 3 additional potential confounding factors that were related to COVID-19 dynamics. So maybe a contributing factor is that in the meantime, the virus spread also to more rural counties in the USA and so less polluted. Next slide. Interestingly, another USA nationwide study, again ecological, that addressed the same query using a multi-pollutant model, didn't find a statistical significant association between PM2.5 and ozone. Next, please. But they found, next. But they found the same observation as the first study of a dose response between increase in NO2 and increase the case fatality rate and mortality rate from COVID-19. Next slide. And a subsequent similar study didn't find an association with any of the particular pollutant except from diesel particulate matter. Next slide. Next. So why this inconsistency in the epidemiological evidence? Well, most of them were not peer-reviewed, so maybe we don't know if there were any methodological flaw. Also, they were ecological by design, so they can be subject to ecological fallacy, given to the fact that you are inferring individual risk estimate by using aggregate data. Also, some of them use absolute number of COVID deaths and not taking into account the underlying population age and sex structure. Also, there was limited or not adjustment for individual confounding factors or spatio-temporal correlation, and also was not taking into account other factors such as population density and mobility. Next slide. So can we conclude that these two global silent killers are partners in crime? Well, for sure, we can say that they share similar target organs and health effects, and even etiopathogenetic mechanisms. But in relation to the increased susceptibility to the infection and severity and mortality from the disease, even if we have a strong supporting evidence from biological studies, I think that we need more epidemiological evidence. And also, I think we should consider the effect of other individual factors, such as genetic variants in the immune system, that can affect both susceptibility to air pollution and SARS-CoV-2 infection. So to conclude, next. We need further more thorough epidemiological studies, and given that these issues not urgent for COVID-19 management, they should pass the standard scientific peer review. Next. And whatever the conclusion will be, I think that we all agree that we should strive to reduce air pollution to level as low as possible and avoid any backlash against the regulation to protect, air pollution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sarah, and especially for the final conclusion message is so important, and you have provided us very important data. Now our next speaker will join us via a pre-recorded presentation. Professor Lydia Moravska, the director of the International Laboratory for Air Quality and Health at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. She's going to speak about air pollution during pandemic and the role of air pollution in transmission of COVID-19, which will be a very interesting talk, I guess. Can we have the video of Lydia, please?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation on the role of air pollution in transmission of COVID-19. I'll focus the presentation on air pollutants as carriers of virus-laden respiratory particles. In this context, we are talking about particles rather than gaseous pollutants. Also, a very important fact is that we are talking about interactions with individual particles, not PM2.5, as it's often mentioned. PM2.5 is mass concentration of particles. So the question is, what are the mechanisms for any interactions of this nature? Let's first set the scene indoor versus outdoors and what occurs where. Well, firstly, air pollution in this context is normally considered or referred to as ambient air pollution. However, indoor air pollution due to outdoor as a source is much lower. Concentrations level are lower than outdoors. And the second important point is that the concentrations of virus-laden particles are much higher indoors than outdoors. And this is because where the source is, which is humans. On the other hand, virus-laden particles emitted outdoors are quickly diluted, and this is because relatively low quantity is emitted to a very large reservoir. We need to keep this setting in context when discussing the mechanism. And now I'll mention 3 points which relate to the focus of my argument. Firstly, particles generated from respiratory activities. The main point is that the vast majority of them are smaller than 10 micrometers, as shown at this size distribution from one of our earlier studies. Similar studies were presented by others. There is not much here in the submicrometer size range because of the instrumental methods we use, but there are particles there as well, as it has been shown by other studies that the distribution extends to below 1 micrometer. The second point is the virus-laden particles from respiratory activities, and the issue that the majority are within the mid-submicrometer range and larger. Now, size of a SARS-CoV-2 naked virus is about 0.012 micrometers. However, size of the virus-laden particles is bigger than this. And this is because the particles contain not only the virus, but also other constituents, water, mucus, salts, and so on. Now, it has also been shown that particles below 1 micrometer contain higher loads of SARS-CoV-2, hence the majority within the mid-submicrometer range and large. And the third point is the size distribution of particles in urban air and the fact that the majority of them are within the lower submicrometer range. And this means that these particles are much smaller than the virus-laden respiratory particles. This is shown on this diagram on studies conducted in Europe, showing that the majority of the particles are in fact in the ultrafine particle range below 1.1 micrometer. So in conclusion, bringing these three aspects together in the indoor setting is the majority of the particles in urban air are small and therefore cannot be carriers of bigger virus-laden particles. Interactions between same size, larger urban and virus particles are slow, on the other hand, because their respective concentrations are low and much smaller, slower than the scale of the indoor air particle dynamics where the exposures occur. Well, this means that any correlations between air pollution in terms of particle mass and daily case or death are proxies for something else. For example, reduced human interaction during lockdowns, and this is when the emissions are lower. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye.
Thank you very much for the great presentation for Lydia Moravska, and she has added very interesting data. I'm sure that we will be discussing it in the Q&A section. The event is being recorded. I just once again repeat it, and will be available from ERS YouTube channel, and the slides will be available on the MEP Langham page very early next week, we hope. Now I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Martin Adams. He leads the program on health and sustainable resource use at the European Environment Agency. This program supports EEA's member countries and the EU institutions in key policy areas of environment and health. Thank you, Martin, for taking the time to join us, and he's going to talk about air quality impacts of COVID lockdown measures in Europe. Please.
Thank you very much, Arzu, and very good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you for this interesting meeting and to present some of the latest information from the European Environment Agency, particularly looking at some of our data, how air quality has been changing as we have seen lockdown measures implemented across Europe. It's a very data-rich presentation. Roberta, could I ask you to please go to the next slide? Thank you. A very data-rich presentation, but by way of introduction, I would just like to perhaps highlight the second and third bullet points you see on the screen here. Firstly, as we've already heard, there are a lot of emerging studies pointing to the fact that long-term exposure to high air pollution may potentially result in more severe health outcomes from COVID. Equally, however, the third point is important. At the European Environment Agency, we have been working and looking at the impacts of social inequality on exposure to environment and climate stresses. And there we know that it's typically more socially deprived communities that are exposed to higher amounts of air pollution. So understanding the confounding factors between these two elements will be very important, I think, for research initiatives going forward. Next slide, please. When it first became clear that many lockdown measures were actually having a noticeable and quantifiable impact on air quality, we produced an online data viewer that really taps into the information that the agency receives from thousands of air quality monitoring stations from across Europe. And here you can just see the representation for Italy, which of course was one of the hardest hit regions at the beginning of the pandemic. And cities such as Bergamo, for example, you can just see by the size of the dots here, the changes of nitrogen dioxide concentrations week by week as a result of the measures put in place and the decreased economic activity in regions. Next slide, thank you. What I would like to do is to present some information which is from our most recent annual report on air quality in Europe, published just last week. This map that you see really shows the extent to which air quality changed in April 2020, which was when many of the largest countries in Europe had very significant lockdowns in place. So I'm talking around countries like Germany, France, Spain, Italy, and the United Kingdom, for example. This analysis was made with the assistance of colleagues at the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service in Europe. And in essence, what it shows is the difference between what we would have expected air quality to be in a normal year versus the reality of what we have seen. So really understanding the impact of the lockdown measures on the changing air quality. Next slide, please. Just on the right-hand side here, you see a visual representation of some of the information. So the dark green figures, the dark green circles in the middle of the figure show for these selected countries what the measured concentrations of nitrogen dioxide was. And the outside circles, the lighter blue, really shows you the expected concentrations without lockdown measures. So this is showing the relative changes that we've seen for these selected countries. And clearly, as I say, the countries that had very strong lockdown measures, Spain, France, Italy, very significant reductions in NO2, up to 60%, even more at road transport sites. Why mention road transport? Many of you I know are very familiar. Nitrogen dioxide in urban areas particularly, the main source is very clearly road transport. And as lockdown measures change the ways that we in societies travel to work or not travel to work as the case may be, changing distribution patterns, we saw a very significant impact on the air quality as mentioned here. Next slide. And next slide again, thanks. So this is the equivalent figures for PM10, so fine particulate matter. Again, significant impacts up to the region, 20–30% in some locations, but less than for NO2. Why is that? Very simply, transport is not necessarily the dominant source of PM10 in many of Europe's cities. There are a number of other important sources in urban areas, and also contributions from outside urban areas as well that Jutta mentioned in her introduction. Sources such as agriculture, particularly in the spring, can also have a very important contribution to background levels. Next slide, please. Now, when we looked at the pre-lockdown period, the lockdown period and the post-lockdown period, we saw different patterns in cities across Europe. Here you can see in the top left the figure for Milan. So you really see quite a significant reduction after the lockdown entered into place around week 11, week 12. After the immediate lockdown, when we did this analysis before the summer, we didn't see much change afterwards. The concentrations stayed very low. And what's important in looking at these information is also look to see how concentrations have changed the previous years. So the figure underneath just shows you that, for example, in the lockdown period, we saw a reduction of -43%, whereas in previous years, you can see the changes of air quality were very much less than that. Next slide, please. I mentioned contrasting situations. This is a different picture from Athens, where we saw a 40% reduction of NO2 following the lockdown in Athens. But then immediately after the lockdown stopped back in the spring, the post-lockdown period shows exactly the same concentrations as before. So levels actually rebounded very quickly, indicating that these improvements in air quality are simply temporary. They're not long-standing measures. And it's not so surprising as we go back to our normal ways of using the transport systems, the usual polluting methods of transport. It's not so surprising that as economic activity goes back to the original levels, of course, air pollution increases as well. Next slide, please. So what happened in Milan? This is some information which we extracted just yesterday, showing the week-by-week concentrations in Milan. And here you can see on the left-hand side, the information from 2018. In the middle is the same weeks for 2019, and then on the right, the same weeks for 2020, with the periods of the lockdown shown there by the purple bars. So Milan, it's taken longer for pollution to get back to normal levels. Economic activity did not bounce back as quickly as in some other cities after the lockdown ceased. But now it's very clear that, well into the, late autumn, early winter, pollution levels are just the same as we've seen in previous years. So just reinforcing the fact that these changes are temporary in nature. Next slide, please. If I may leave you with 4 key conclusions. First of all, lockdown measures. Very clearly, we've seen some important reductions in pollutions, certainly for NO2 and for PM10 and PM2.5 as well. We've seen very different patterns across Europe. Some, very significant reductions, countries like Spain, which I mentioned, 60% for NO2, but less reductions elsewhere in Europe. Similarly, for PM10, I've mentioned the reductions are smaller in quantitative size and relative size, but very important nevertheless. But importantly, as for NO2, these concentrations have gone back. We didn't look at ozone yet in our analyses. That is ongoing work, but we weren't so much interested in ozone in the early spring in Europe because it tends not to be a problem. It's mainly a problem over the summer months where, of course, the sunlight promotes and catalyzes the formation of ozone in the atmosphere. But there I would say there are a number of studies that have pointed to the fact that in some areas, as NO2 decreases, the ozone concentrations have actually increased, which is to do with the very complex ozone chemistry. A final point around research needs. I think the other speakers will highlight particularly this, but understanding the links between previous exposure to air pollution and COVID-related impacts will be important. Also the role of particulate matter as a vector, as we've heard from the preceding speaker. One final, more political point away from the data from our side is that at the European Environment Agency, we first of all very much recognise there's been a huge significant societal cost here. So it's not just about the sort of intellectual interest in looking at changes in air quality. We realise the pandemic has hit many communities extremely hard. It's also clear that this is not the way that we wish to improve air quality in Europe at this very high societal cost. And equally, though, it is important we learn lessons from what has happened in terms of the sectors and measures that can be used to reduce and improve air quality further. So with all the initiatives going on for the post-COVID recovery, one clear message from our side is very much the need to make sure that the investments being made are entirely consistent with Europe's long-term environment and climate objectives as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, especially for those important messages. We have experienced how an air pollution-free world could be, but we don't want it to be due to pandemic. With the legislation we have, we hope to have an air pollution-free world after pandemic also. Now, our final speaker in this segment is Professor Eva Furman. She is the director of the Environment Policy Center, Finnish Environment Institute, chair of the Finland Sustainable Development Expert Panel, and a member of the independent group of scientists who wrote the UN's Global Sustainable Development Report. Professor Furman will be joining us by her phone because she has a problem with her computer. Professor Furman, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do. The floor is yours. Please go on.
Okay, thank you very much. So greetings from Helsinki. I've been listening with my ear all the presentations here, and it's been very interesting discussion, and I I will take a little bit broader view now to the subject. So if you could put the first slide with a globe on it and see how we as humans are in a way in between two dimensions of life on Earth. We have the microbial system that actually is inside our bodies, and then we have the entire planet with its ecosystems that is affecting our health as well. So next slide, please. And here we can see the planet again, and we all know that the planet as a whole is not sustainable at all. We have huge problems with the environment, climate change, waste, but also issues like inequality. And all these are highly linked with each other. And the Agenda 2030, which is the United Nations compass towards a safe and just world, is really taking us to that direction. And if I get the next slide, please. So I would like to start by reminding about the natural ecosystems, which are in a way the common environmental commons, global environmental commons. And we are disturbing these highly at the moment in the societies. And to start with, here is a picture from South America and showing how the forest, burning of forests is taking place all the time. So if I get the next slide, please, with the maps of black carbon emissions. So we can see what kind of impacts do these have on the planet and on our health. And the black carbon emissions is deriving from most countries in the world and gets transported by air and water, air currents to the Arctic. And it has twofold impacts on the environment. Firstly, it affects the climate change because the white becomes black, but it's also black carbon, a huge problem for health. And here again, it's the forest fires, it's the household combustions, which are all linked with our environment. So if you take the next one, my second example links also with the disturbed ecosystem. Our human contact with healthy microbial diversity is actually taking care of our human immune system. And when this connection from our bodies to the ecosystems with a healthy microbial system is cut, there becomes a dysfunction, and which this is causing lots of inflammatory illnesses. And this is called the biodiversity hypothesis. And if I get the next slide, please, it's again about the disturbed ecosystems. And we are coming to the zoonoses and the planetary pandemics of the COVID, for example. And surprisingly, the threat of zoonotic pathogens to humans is increasing when we are declining the wildlife populations. And this is the same system we had with the biodiversity hypothesis, with the immune system, that when we are disturbing the ecosystems, the natural control mechanisms are disturbed. And then the population sizes of individual species are kind of exploding, whether they are viruses or something else. And these are causing the challenges. So next slide, please, is the Helsinki Declaration that was initiated by a workshop that took place exactly a year ago in Helsinki by the initiative from the European Commission. It was organized during Finland's presidency. That's why the name is the kind. But it is about protecting human and planetary health together, which takes us to the planetary health approach. It means that actually we need to be able to have a healthy human population. We need to also a healthy ecosystem and ecosystems on planetary scale. So could I get the next one then? And this is the issue that could actually this COVID period speed up the progress of planetary health a little bit. That was brought up by Martin Adams just previously. And what could be the policies to be used here? And if I get the next slide about HERA. HERA is the project of the European Commission that is building an environmental research agenda on health for Europe, and very much looking at the governance and the policy framework for the European Union to be able to support the European needs of the Green Deal, but also the global Agenda 2030. And if I get the next slide, please. So just last week, actually, there was a paper coming out from the HERA project, and it's all on the website. It's about recommendations, research recommendation for policy when we look at this environment, climate, health link together with the COVID-19. And we can see that it's not only in one place, but it's affecting the whole kind of space where we are dealing when we are dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, from the emergence actually to the socioeconomic recovery plan. And I can't more agree with Martin Adams of the fact that it's the vulnerable populations that are really crucial in this situation that has to, in particular, be paid more attention to. If I get the next one with the green boxes, so I would like to finish by saying that we are really in a crossroads, and this is a very serious stage, and it's a conscious choice where we are going, and it does matter. So if we are at the moment fine-tuning the existing policies, it could be we need to do that, but actually it only keeps us in the business as usual. What we really need is a more systemic approach to look at the European key societal systems that provide us food, energy, transport, economy, and so forth, and transform these. And here we need to go across different sectors and different niches. And this is the sustainability-oriented path that takes us to the direction we really need to go. And the most risky business is the one that if we strive actually to go back to where we were and somehow think that everything becomes as it was, we really lose the opportunity. And this is a very risk-linked situation. And if I get to my final slide, it is about the Global Sustainable Development Report, which emphasizes very important issues for this meeting. The first one is that the policy needs to really work together with business communities and science to fine-tune and integrate the levers of these three. Second point is that we need really to identify how we find the link from human health to the other societal systems. That we look actually at human health with the lens of food, energy, economy, and urbanization, for example. Not talking about human opportunities and the whole common environmental commons global. And then finally, it is very important to start by identifying the links between the health actions to other goals for planetary health and Agenda 2030, so that we don't do something that is hindering another goal to go forward, because at the end, this will be only a merry-go-round. We really need to make a big leap at the moment. So if I get my final slide, I would just like to finish by saying that planetary health leads to a healthier Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Forman. Helsinki Challenge is a very good example for us how we can go to planetary health, and we should shift ourselves only thinking with human health, but our planetary health is more important. That COVID pandemic showed us this. Thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers, all the panelists that had been a very informative session. And now we are at the beginning of the other session, second part of our meeting. And I would like to hand over to Dan Greenbaum from Health Effects Institute. And he's going to introduce the virtual roundtable. Thank you very much for your attention. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Arzu. And very nice to be here. We have had the opportunity to have extraordinarily valuable and broad presentations from a number of experts just now. And it's my responsibility to now begin to bring that into some really good opportunities and ideas from an excellent panel that we've convened. And hopefully to have a broader conversation. There is a Q&A section. We're going to be following those questions, and hopefully we'll have some time near the end to get to those. First of all, let me just say that on behalf of the Health Effects Institute, we're very pleased to co-sponsor this. We've been working obviously with European scientists, with scientists around the world for some time, with our State of Global Air report, and we think this is a very important issue going forward, this intersection between COVID and air pollution. Now, however, that we're going to take a panel to say, well, this is what we know right now. Where should we be going? How do we look forward? What should the global and regional and national health agencies do to address this air quality and public health concern? What are the key research questions still to be addressed? We've heard some of those, and we have some speakers on the panel to speak about that. And what actions is the European Commission considering in the areas of air quality and climate that would also begin to address some of the risks that come with air pollution that may be contributing as well to enhancing or strengthening the COVID impacts? We have, as I said, an excellent panel, and I'm going to turn to them to each make some comments. They include Maria Nera, who is the director of the Public Health, Environment, and Social Determinants of Health Department at the World Health Organization in Geneva. We have Mary Rice, who is from Harvard University and chair of the American Thoracic Society Environmental Health Policy Committee. We have Erica Colin, a volunteer for the Belgian Asthma and Allergy Association. And very importantly, she's going to share some of the patients' perspectives on these issues. We have Dr. Rivercraft, a long-standing professor at Utrecht University, and Francesco Forestieri, who is currently a professor at Imperial College London, to speak about what we need to know further in some of these research areas. And very fortunately, we have Francois Walken, who is the head of the Clean Air unit in DG Environment of the European Commission, who can speak to some of the Commission's plans and interests. And obviously, for some closing thoughts and comments, we will return to our very fortunate member of the European Parliament, Jutta Paulus from Germany, to give us some closing thoughts. So with that, let me turn now to Maria Nera and ask her to give a few brief comments on WHO's perspective, important perspective on these questions.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all for organizing this extremely important webinar. And a pleasure to see that there are almost 400 people following and interested on this very critical topic. You heard from science what we know at the moment, but I think we are in front of a very exceptional situation that we cannot miss. And it's not to talk about the famous mantra that everybody's repeating now, saying that we need to transform this into an opportunity. It's just to simply understanding that if people, the society who is now very sensible and vulnerable, and even I would say psychologically terrified by what is suffering at the moment, we need to provide to the society back some very strong arguments how this vulnerability can be reduced and how can we protect ourselves for the next crisis, whether it will be of infectious, caused by an infectious agent or caused by climate change or caused by the pollution that we are facing at the moment. So in that sense, I think we need to put all of those arguments in positive. And that's why in WHO, one of the, I don't know whether this is a research question or a fundamental and philosophical question we are asking ourselves every day. How can we reach the point where we are now? How could we as a society accept to have so many systemic failures, because those were systemic failures, the ones that took us to the moment where we are facing this terrible emergence of a virus, but it could be something else. And how can we repair all of those systemic failures all at the same time while we contribute as well to a very good economic recovery, putting again these green walls to better protect our health for the future and making sure that the society will recover as well. In WHO, we call it a manifesto, and we presented it a few months ago, and the idea was to provide 6 logic, common sense, basic prescriptions for this healthy and green recovery. The first one, I think everybody will agree with me, I hope, that we need to recover our relationship with the ecosystems, with biodiversity, with the environment in which from which we take the water we drink, the food we eat, and the air we breathe. The second will be take advantage of this to fill the terrible gap that we still have in the provision of basic services like water and sanitation and hygiene to the society. Still half of the global population will not have access to safe water, while the basic and the most important public health recommendation to deal with the virus will be exactly that, will be wash your hands for half of the world. This is easy to say, but difficult to implement. Third one is critical and very much related to what we are discussing here today. We need to we accelerate and we provide the very strong and influential health arguments in order to accelerate, scale up massively this transition to a renewable sources of energy, to healthy, to clean sources of energy. Otherwise, these fossil fuels will keep killing us and being responsible for the 7 million premature deaths every year. Prescription number 4 will be, again, a very basic and absolutely common sense, which is about the production of food, ensuring a more sustainable food production, consumption, and waste management. And I'm sure that you will endorse this one as well. Number 5 will be our cities, our urban development, our urban and land planning. It has to be a healthy and sustainable one. And I think the interventions that we can have at the city level, now that we are in the middle of such a situation, if we don't change and we do not involve on a most strategic way the mayors and local decision makers, we will miss this opportunity. And we need to make sure as well, and this will be prescription number 6, we need to make sure that now that the countries, the governments are using huge stimulus packages, huge financial resources, the Europeans, but as well outside Europe, enormous amount of funds to recover after COVID-19. We need to make sure that this money is going into the right direction. And I'm afraid we see already that we are still sending subsidies to coal, subsidies to fossil fuels in general. And while we are saying that this is one of the reasons why we are now confronting the situations we are confronting. So we need to, as health sector on a broad sense of the term, we need to be very vocal, very influential. We have tons of evidence. Of course, we are missing evidence everywhere. Of course, always in science, you miss evidence, but we have enough to provoke the shift that we all need. And another thing that in terms of the previous presentations about the correlation between COVID-19 and air pollution, we still need science, we still need more evidence, but there is something that we know already, that tackling the causes of air pollution will certainly do not damage the response to COVID-19. At the contrary, we need to, by default, tackling the causes of air pollution. And for that, we don't need more evidence. Of course, we need to look at our research agenda and make the causality and relationship between the two things. But no matter what, it's a non-regrets investment, the fact that you need to tackle the causes of air pollution. And this eventually will contribute as well to reduce susceptibility and mortality and eventually even more. But for sure, by default, you need to do it. You need to tackle the causes of air pollution and don't accept any other excuse that will divert us from the real agenda. The real agenda is reduce those 7 million premature deaths and all the morbidities associated with that, and the cost for the society that this represents, and how this air pollution represents a massive vulnerability for the crisis we are suffering or those that could come in the future. I will stop here, Dan. I could, as you know, keep forever, but definitely as putting some thought to open the dialogue that I'm sure will be very exciting. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your leadership in general on this, and also much more broadly for really a roadmap for how we should be thinking about what do we do next. That's the main thing. It's not as we start to recover, will we truly recover and make further progress? So those are very good points. I'm hoping we'll have some time for further comments. I know there are some questions in the Q&A about the air quality guidelines that I think that we'll be able to address. Maybe you or others can address. I would like to turn now to Mary Rice, who has been working with the European Respiratory Society, the American Thoracic Society, International Society for Environmental Epidemiology, to also put forward a plan for how building on the WHO plan. So Mary, I turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's truly an honor to be a part of this very important event today. I'm a pulmonologist and a critical care physician in Boston. And in addition to caring for patients with chronic lung disease and treating COVID-19 patients in the ICU, I study the respiratory health effects of air pollution exposure. I chair the Environmental Health Policy Committee of the American Thoracic Society, and we have been very engaged on air quality and climate policy issues at the national level in the United States. And even before it emerged that long-term air pollution exposure may be a risk factor for more severe illness from COVID-19, the pandemic alerted us to a number of issues. Firstly, the importance of lung health and our vulnerability to infectious respiratory pathogens that can spread rapidly in our highly mobile society. Secondly, the massive disparities in social determinants of health that are just plainly visible in this pandemic in the United States and around the world. And thirdly, society's remarkable willingness to make severe personal and economic sacrifices for the sake of health, especially when decision-making is transparent and evidence-based. And motivated by these issues and the WHO manifesto, the members of the American Thoracic Society, the European Respiratory Society, and ISEE came together as professional societies dedicated to promoting respiratory and environmental health to write a statement that you can view online. You can see it in the chat. It's entitled Bounce Back Better, Sustainable Strategies for a Healthy Recovery from the Pandemic. As we emerge from the devastation of this terrible and deadly pandemic, this is also a historic opportunity to rethink our priorities and our investment strategies and move our energy, industry, transportation, and agriculture sectors away from fossil fuels for the sake of health and to promote healthier lifestyles and sustainable urban environments. We ask that local and national strategies ensure that populations who are already at a health disadvantage, who live in polluted areas, are privileged in this transition to clean energy and healthy, sustainable urban living. A clean energy transition and sustainable urban planning will reduce air pollution, and that will improve health immediately. And at the same time, it will cut emissions of greenhouse gases that cause climate change. which is the great public health and existential challenge of our time. So I hope that the participants of this event read our statement, and the leadership and doctors and scientists of the European and American Respiratory Societies and ISEE ask that in the wake of the COVID-19 tragedy, we acknowledge the interdependence between our health and the environment. And rather than slip back into the ways that contributed to the climate and COVID-19 emergencies that we now face, we must use policy to leap forward to a healthier future. I really look forward to discussing these issues further with the panel at the end of this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was an excellent summary, and it's important to recall for all of us involved here, some of whom are researchers, some of whom come from various places around the world, that there are physicians day in and day out treating people with this disease. And we're treating people affected by air pollution before this disease. So it's great to have your perspective participate in that. And thank you for that.
You.
Hopefully we can get some conversation going further. The other side of that relationship is the patient relationship. And I think it's important for us to remember the perspective of the patients, the people who are suffering from respiratory disease and other things who may be particularly susceptible to this. And for that, we have the opportunity to hear from Erica Colin, who is a volunteer for the Belgian Asthma and Allergy Association, who can give us some perspective on from the patient's point of view.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here to represent the people with asthma and airway diseases, because we are the people who suffer first and foremost from air pollution. As the levels of air pollution rise, we are limited in our daily activities. Our health deteriorates, and sometimes it even ends in the emergency room. So we are very interested in how we can lessen the levels of air pollution. We realize that we can't hide from it. That's the big problem, of course. You can't just run away from polluted areas. So it's very important that society realizes that this air pollution has health effects on short term and long term, so that we really do something to get it down. Now, I'd like to hear about what we're going to do to prevent fossil fuels and so, but I would also like to emphasize the effect of wood burning, because that's a type of smoke that can be very irritating, and it can really cause severe asthma attacks. So that's one perspective that I think is also very important. And just getting down the global levels of air pollution would be a very good cause to work for. So that's why I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much. And I will note that in the questions and answers, we did have somebody point out that in the second sets of lockdowns that are occurring now in many parts of the world, Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, there has been an increase in wood burning because people are spending more times indoors. So we can't simply suggest that these reductions in economic activity always have benefits for air quality. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
I want to turn now to a couple of eminent scientists who've been involved in looking at air pollution and health for a number of years. And have been and are leading significant studies across all of Europe. First, Dr. Bert Rivercraft from Utrecht University, and I believe he's going to share a few slides as part of his comments.
Yes, thank you, Dan. We're going to shift to the research side now, as you say. You've heard about ecological studies from Sarah de Matthijs in the very beginning of this event today. And I think it's important to understand the limitations of these studies better. And we're going to look at one example of an ecological study on air pollution and COVID in the Netherlands. This is the title slide of that presentation, that study. This is a study that aggregated data by municipality in the Netherlands, and we have 355 municipalities in the Netherlands. Supposed now to get the next slide by pushing a button, but I'm not getting it, so okay, thank you. This study was an ecological analysis of 355 municipalities, and it looked at 3 different COVID endpoints until June 5 of this year. Air pollution was averaged over the 2015 to 2019 period, and a bunch of covariates were obtained from public sources. And again, everything was aggregated to the municipality level, so each municipality, big or small, represents 1 data point. The figure you're looking at right now comes from the article. It shows that air pollution and cases were high in the south of the country and low in the north. And this produced a positive association between air pollution and COVID after adjustment for a bunch of covariates. But the question is, what do such data actually look like if you look at the details? And I'm going to zoom in on 1 municipality, which is located in the black box on the right-hand side of the graph. Here it is. This is the municipality of the Bild, which is where I happen to live myself. And remember, in the analysis that was done in this study, we have 1 number for COVID, 1 number for PM, 1 number for covariates in this area. That's all we have. And then we have 354 of those numbers for the other municipalities in the Netherlands. Next one, but what does the real world actually look like for a municipality like this? This municipality is made up of 6 different villages within the black lines, if you look carefully. And there's lots of empty space in between those villages, actually. Most people live in a small area in the southeast of the municipality, and averaging air pollution and population density and what have you over the whole surface area of such a municipality doesn't mean very much for the actual exposures and the experiences of the people who live in this municipality. Next one. To illustrate that further, this is a map of what the NO2 concentrations look like in this municipality. And the highest concentration are actually in 3 of the smallest villages in the municipality, and those happen to be located along a busy freeway. So that shows you how the differences can be substantial within an area like this. We have the tools to analyze such data at the individual address level, at the individual disease level, at exposure level. But such studies are much more demanding than running a bunch of quick correlations from publicly available aggregated data, which is unfortunately what we've seen mostly so far in this field as it has emerged over the last eight months or so. The final note on this slide, it compares cases in the first wave to the right, when this correlation was established, and data distribution at the start of the second wave to the left. And as you can see, the hotspots in the beginning of the second wave were in quite different areas from where they were in the beginning. That already shows you how difficult it is to draw firm conclusions on these types of studies. That's it, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I really appreciate your bringing some facts into this and some of the challenges that we have in trying to figure out where do we go forward. And given that, I'm going to turn to another scientist with a very strong experience in this arena, Dr. Francesco Forestieri. I describe him as being from Imperial College London. We all know that he's actually from emeritus from the health department in Lazio in Italy. But please, Francesco, please share your thoughts.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar. I would be very brief on specific research needs that we have, and I have 3 major points. One is about the relationship between air pollution and COVID-19, as Sarah has been presenting, and also as Bert has illustrated with the example. All we have is correlation studies, and in epidemiology, of course, correlation studies are useful to raise the issue and to generate hypotheses, but we really need individual studies. And the research question that we have, of course, are various. We need to know whether Air pollution is related to incidence of the disease, it's related to the severity of the disease, and whether it's related to the long-term consequences of the disease. And individual studies means cohort studies or case control studies. The epidemiology, environmental epidemiology community has a long experience in studying this type of relationship with large data sets. If you think the huge amount of individuals that have been assessed both in Canada, US, and also in Europe in air pollution studies, we should repeat this for air pollution and COVID-19. If we need individual studies, we need exposure assessment at individual level. And that's very important because all we know, as Bert has shown, are only area-based exposure assessment. And when we speak about confounders, we need confounders at individual level, and we need to address one of the specific issues that we have for COVID-19. COVID-19 is related to human exposure. And the confounders that we want are proxies, we should be proxies of this human-to-human exposure. And that's very important, and we need to go ahead with just trying to fulfill this research needs. There is another issue, which is the relationship between COVID-19 lockdown and the variability in decrease of air pollution in Europe, for instance. And the question is this the consequence of lockdown has a different effect on decreasing air pollution? Is this related to health and positive health effects? This is a very difficult question, of course, but we need to address this question because it's very, very important to understand better the role of air pollution. And the last issue we have, of course, in this, we had plenty of data presented for the COVID-19, but we claim that the epidemiology has not been there. The way that the data have been presented, think about, we never had adjusted rates for COVID-19. People still report number of cases. So we need to have data transparency, and we need to solve the privacy issue, because if we need to do individual studies, we have to resolve the issue of the confidentiality. And with these indications, I think that research needs should be fulfilled. And I think Health Effect Institute has already started with a specific call for research and for these specific aspects. Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all.
The infamous problem of remembering to unmute oneself. Thank you very much, Francesco. So we've laid out the challenges, we've talked about the problem. Inevitably, it requires officials to take on the problem and come up with solutions, ways to move forward. And Maria Nera identified some of those and talked about some of those. Our next speaker, Francois Walken, who heads the part of the European Commission with principal responsibility for this clean air issue. And we'll turn to him to talk about his thoughts and their thoughts for moving forward.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you indeed for the opportunity to be at this event. I think that, for us in the Commission, this is an ideal opportunity. You know how much we care about evidence-based policymaking in this institution. So this is really a perfect moment for us to listen to eminent scientists and experts and learn in terms of solutions that we need to import into our policymaking process indeed. So where do we come from in terms of the policy process precisely? Well, in a week from now, we'll be celebrating the first anniversary of the European Green Deal. It was adopted on the 11th of December last year. And you know that the European Green Deal is our strategy to be the first climate neutral continent in the world. But beyond that, it is a strategy that has been defined as a transformative one that will turn the EU into a modern, resource efficient and competitive economy. And as part of it, we do have what we call a zero pollution ambition. And under the umbrella of the zero pollution ambition, clean air is at the core. It is a major preoccupation of our citizens in Europe. Together with climate change, clean air recurrently appears at the very top of all environmental concerns of our citizens. This is a cause for more action at European level. And in the European Green Deal, we've announced already that we will propose to revise our air quality standards to align them more closely with the World Health Organization recommendations. And Maria, here present, told us about the manifesto, but there's also, of course, all the work that is being done now to finalize the updated guidelines, and we're following this with great interest. So for us, the prerequisite for further action in terms of more ambitious EU quality standards is to get the guidelines, obviously, and we have already indicated very clearly in publicly available material. So we have a dedicated better regulation portal that is called Have Your Say, that already announced by 2022, in the third part of the year, that we will actually have a proposal on the table of the European Parliament and the Council, so the member states, to look at the revised air quality standards, among other elements that we'll cover. We will have ample consultations throughout the preparatory period, including in 2021, mainly through a dedicated public consultation, but we'll also have discussions in Green Week. We'll have discussions at the next Clean Air Forum at the end of 2021, and those will provide all of you, all of those stakeholders in this debate to actually feed into our discussions and guide us towards the solutions that we need. Now, what about COVID in all this? Well, it's been said already and very clearly that the first lockdown has had a very sizable impact on air quality reduction for some pollutants, at least, certainly nitrogen dioxide, in many of our member states. But this has come as a significant cost to our society. We are going in Europe through a major recession, as is the case in other parts of the world. So there's certainly nothing to rejoice over in terms of the crisis that we're going through and what we've been able to achieve in terms of emission reductions and concentration level reductions through that crisis. We need to focus first and foremost on the overcoming of the crisis. But as you know, the saying goes, never waste a crisis. So in doing that, we are certainly learning lessons from the lockdown measures. And what we've seen is that we can achieve very drastic reductions, but what we need to do now is to build those into a structural change. And that is what the green recovery strategy that we adopted a couple months ago, which is, I think, extraordinary in terms of the amounts that we're talking about, but also in terms of the substance of what we're to do with it. Because as you know, we have a number of key principles that are linked to green recovery. This is about building back better. This is about the do no harm principle. This is about delivering the society that will actually allow us to deliver on the objectives of the European Green Deal, including on zero pollution, including on our clean air objectives. So what we need now is certainly to continue to redouble efforts to make sure that what we've got already, which is a very strong legislation on air quality, is implemented, is enforced. We have a very high number of infringements, which is no source of satisfaction for us because it shows the extent of the problem we still face in Europe, but it also shows how resolute we are to address the problem in the interests of our citizens. We heard from patients earlier, and I can really guarantee to you that my commissioner, that the commission in general, is going to continue to make sure that what we've got on the table, however, not as ambitious as the current air quality guidelines from the WHO, and certainly nowhere near where we need to be in terms of the levels of exposure that we need to have in Europe. But this is already an extremely powerful tool to make a difference for our citizens. And we are continue to make ample use of it as part of our powers to make sure that air quality is actually in line with what the legislation says, and as from the revision, in line with closer alignment with the WHO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois. And I think Europe has positioned itself to be a leader in this, both in its response to COVID and among many countries, and also now trying to set itself on a very positive path. We have many questions. We will not, unfortunately, be able to get to all of them. We have a few that I would like to get to. Before we do that, there is one specific question which you alluded to and that was in the chat. And Maria, if I could ask you to comment on this, which is the process by which WHO is currently finalizing the air quality guidelines. And maybe you could, without putting you on the spot, give people an update on where that process is. It's moved a long ways, so that everybody knows. And as Francois said, that's an important precursor to the European movement forward as well.
Thank you, Dan. I know that there is a lot of interest on that, and we are certainly very much pushing the movement, the process for making sure that if everything goes well, hopefully by April, spring next year, we will be able to have the new air quality guidelines. This will be a critical moment in terms of advocacy and again, raising awareness about the importance of air pollution. We know that for many countries, this can be a challenge, but I hope that this movement will be ready to join us on the launch of these new guidelines without anticipating any of the new standards will give us, but expecting probably that is something that will generate a lot of hopefully interest, commitment by the countries, and advocacy by all of us to make sure that the European Commission and all the rest of the countries will do their best to be as close as possible to those recommendations by WHO. If you allow me, and I'm sure that Erica will be is following this very, very closely. Today we are on day 3 or 2 on a court case in London about a little girl, 9 years old, dead, whether it was from asthma, Ella, Kissy, Deborah. And if there is a court case stating that the cause of death was air pollution, I think that can be an incredible shift and an incredible change and a big step on our cause. Over.
That's a very good point. And Erica, actually, there was a specific question, which is a good follow-up to that, which I would ask you to comment on, which was coming to you directly, which is, what do patients tell you about the impact of air pollution in their life, and have those stories changed during COVID-19?
The patients, mainly when they don't know what's causes their problems, they are looking for why they are breathless some days, and other days things are better. And we mostly have to coach them and teach them to be alert for air pollution in their environment. And after a while, they start realizing that when there are days that they really feel as if they have no energy and all exercise is difficult. Sometimes I have headaches. Sometimes you just don't succeed in going for their normal runners. So, and very often it is because the levels of air pollution are higher. Mainly ozone is a type of air pollution that can be very debilitating for people with airway diseases. But now we notice also that with the lockdown, during the lockdown, it was better because the levels of particulate matter and so were down. And in the summer, there was also less ozone than other years. But now it's becoming colder and people are starting to burn wood to say it's very cozy to have a wood fire in your house. And even our politicians say you can meet a certain amount of people outdoors. So maybe it's a good idea to burn some wood and to meet each other there. And now the levels of wood smoke are rising, and the people are letting us know that they feel it and that it is very annoying for them. Not only can it be can their illness become worse, but for some people it really means that they have severe asthma attacks or even bronchitis, and that they have to go into hospital because of the wood smoke of their neighbors. So it is a real problem for people with airway diseases.
Thank you very much, and that is a perspective we should all remember. Obviously, I think we have time for one more. There are a couple of questions, several that revolved around the fact that as we start to reopen economies at different stages, as different actions take place, as several of you talked about, Europe invests a lot of money in recovery funds. There is some concern that not every action being taken is going to be as positive as one would hope. Traffic restrictions may be reduced, but people may be more hesitant to use public transportation. And does that mean we'll have more traffic on the roads? There have been some reports, I gather, of some of the member states using some of the recovery funds for things, and I think Maria alluded to this, that may not be as green or as air quality oriented. But Francois, you mentioned this, but what kinds of steps is the Commission taking to, that's the question that came in, to really address getting as much of the resource that's going into recovery going in the right and green direction?
Yeah, no, this is a very good question. And as I indicated, recovery is going to be critical to achieve the change that we require. And in terms of the process that is in place, I mean, first of all, this is an unprecedented situation that we're in. We've never managed that type of situation before at European level. And I dare say at world level, because we're talking about a very diverse set of member state situations that we're also trying to cater for in the circumstances. So the process is defined by priorities that are, of course, prepared by the member states. And this goes through a very detailed scrutiny, which ensures that all that is foreseen is going to be in line with the priorities that we've set out, not least the priorities stemming from the European Green Deal. And I mentioned earlier on in my intro talk, the do no harm principle, which is a clear priority that we've introduced in the context of the Green Deal. And there's certainly going to be a very close scrutiny to make sure that what is foreseen responds to the very legitimate need of member states to guarantee a quick and fast recovery, because the social and economic challenges and hardships that our member states face cannot be underestimated, but this can certainly not be at the expense of the path and the trajectory that we're moving towards, which is, as far as I'm concerned, clean air. As far as the broader stakes are concerned, zero pollution, climate neutrality, and those objectives we will not be deterred from. The Commission has been very firm. Executive Vice President Timmermans has been very clear. Our President, Mrs. von der Leyen, has been very clear as well about the fact that the recovery will have to be green. This is the only recovery we can afford. Otherwise, we will actually collectively fail, and we know that we cannot repeat the mistakes of the past.
Thank you, and great respect for those of you who have to grapple with these and implement things on a detailed basis for a very diverse group of member states across Europe. So thank you very much for that information. As I move to turn this for the closing remarks to another person who has something to say about European actions, our member of the European Parliament, Jutta Paulus, I just wanted to make a couple of quick comments. One is, of course, there is still more research to be done, and we do need to do it. And we at the Health Effects Institute are about to fund some new studies in both Europe and the United States on the connections between COVID and air quality and susceptibility. But having said that, we have far less question about the issue of whether air pollution is causing effects. And there is very little question, and Maria Nera made this point abundantly clear, that actions to improve air quality have significant public health benefit for a number of respiratory diseases, of which COVID is one. So there's actions to be taken now. There's still research to be done because we need to always find out more. But it is important to respond in the most productive way possible to these dual issues, as one of our speakers said. With that, I'm pleased to turn this over for the last word to a very important person. This is the person who is involved in thinking about these questions from the perspective of the European Parliament. Jutta Paulus, please.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thanks to all the panelists for this very important event and for the insights that you gave us. I think it is truly important, and I will alert all my fellow MEPs working on health issues to the recording of this webinar. Fortunately, we have this opportunity to make the contents available to those that have not had the opportunity to join in today. And I guess I will watch it again myself because it was so much information. It's difficult to take it up just within 1.5 hours. Having heard from you all on the impacts of air pollution on health, and especially since you, Dan, have just pointed out that we need legislative action, I would like to remind everyone that we have in Europe this wonderful principle of precautionary principle. So, of course, while research is crucial and fundamental and important, it should not prevent us from acting, because what we already know is by far and large sufficient to take legislative action. And we tend to hear these calls on, well, we need more research, and these things are not really settled yet. For quite a long time, I remember that the tobacco industry always called for more research, whether smoking might be really contributing to health issues. And from what we have learned from this debate is that when it comes to health, we should rather not wait too long for research, but act as soon as we know that there might be issues. When it comes to air pollution, a lot that is connected to industrial activity is already addressed more or less with a precautionary principle, because Europe is setting the best available techniques, saying, well, of course, as long as we don't have an alternative to, for example, producing electricity from fossil fuels, we at least have to make sure that the plants are as clean as possible. And because my second or third or whatever field is energy politics, I would really like to point out that the transition to renewable energy is a huge opportunity for also cutting air pollution at a really large measure, and we should not let this angle of the energy transition out of sight, because I guess everyone knows at least one person suffering from one or even more respiratory diseases. So thank you very much all again for these important insights, and I would really like to focus on the One Health approach, which has also been pointed out. The WHO has made their own demands on how to build back better. And in this context, I remember that we had a very good webinar on the connection between COVID-19 and the pressure on wilderness areas and the destruction of biodiversity, which was also touched in your contents. And so I guess we should learn from this crisis that everything is connected. No one is living on an island, and we are all one humanity on one planet, and we have to tackle the COVID crisis together, and we also have to tackle climate and biodiversity crisis together. And I hope that might be one of the lessons which we have learned from this exceptional situation the world has been in for the past year and still is in, although there is with the vaccines a glimpse of hope at the horizon. So thank you for organizing this event, and I would like to turn over to our moderator for the closing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jutta, for these closing remarks. On the behalf of the European Respiratory Society Environment and Health Committee that I'm chairing, I would like to express huge thanks to Lung Health Group and you, Jutta, for participating and hosting this event today. This is just the second event of this group, and we are delighted that we have opportunity today together to bring attention to this important topic. And to summarize, I think we all agree and have learned today that COVID-19 is just another reason and perhaps an opportunity to do more about air pollution. The cleaner air is a way forward for healthier lungs of European citizens, for better overall health, and perhaps for building resilience of our populations to manage better viral pandemics as we are experiencing now and possible future pandemics as such. I hope that this event will provide you with helpful information and really full-fledged support to your important work, your hard work to ensure policies that will bring cleaner air to Europe and Europeans. So thank you. I will also like to thank WHO, Health Effects Institute and International Society for Environmental Epidemiology for providing support and endorsing this meeting. I would like to thank our chairs, Arzu Jorganjoğlu and Dan Greenbaum, for excellent discussions and leading this event, to all our speakers for excellent contributions and taking time to bring your expertise to event today. I would like to give special thanks to Barbara Hoffman, former chair of Environmental Health Committee at ERS, whose shoes I'm filling in now, and Hannah Bogart, who from Health Effects Institute and the chair of the European chapter of ISEE, both of whom made an invaluable contribution to planning this event and bringing the right speakers and panelists around to make this a success. And last but not least, I would like to thank Roberta Saduskatje and Brian Ward from ERS Brussels office for also planning this event and making this a success. And with this, I would like to thank everybody for listening, to wish you to stay safe and healthy, and I will by this close this event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.